And so this would be pretty typical if you've got the setback of 35 feet in COD-N, and just landscaping that is illustrated according to the landscaping standards with street trees. And then if you're in COD, that's that difference between the 50 feet and 100 feet, and you can see how in the 100 feet it's a little bit looser in the landscaping because less would be required. Some of the other things about dimensional requirements and setbacks, there are a number of ways that people will probably need to be able to use their setbacks. So we've got some limitations on how those setbacks can be used. Certainly you want to be able to have some pedestrian walkways, lighting, furnishings, things like that that you would expect to see out in front of buildings. Some of the things that we're also describing in there, I'll point out to you, retaining walls. There may be instances where you have to have retaining walls, but to minimize the visual impact of a really high retaining wall, the idea that it could be terraced, so several walls can be used and terraced as long as no section of any wall is more than 10 feet from base to cap. Another one that we have set through this process is building height. And in COD-N, we've got a 45-foot maximum building height, but we also have a minimum of 24 feet. And that is related to the scale. When you think about the width of the bypass and the buildings that could be out there on the street and how they would address the street, having 24 feet gets a better scale along that bypass than if it was something lower than that. In COD, the balance of it is just whatever the underlying zoning would require. There are a few notes about this that you should be aware of, is that if you've got a building that's less than 2,500 square feet, that minimum does not apply. When you get that small, the minimum height doesn't matter so much. We're more concerned with the larger buildings that have more of a presence along that road.
Would you talk about the minimum height requirement for a little bit? We've had some questions come up.
Okay.
What's our thought process there?
So our thought process is, you know, if it's a one-story building, you've got a 100-foot right-of-way. And initially, it'll be a narrower road until it gets expanded to its full 5-lane section. And that whole scale across there can seem very large if it's not framed and really edged by buildings that have enough of a presence along there. And really, we're talking about when you're in COD-N and trying to get the scale right and make it a really inviting place, let you know you've arrived somewhere as you reach each of these nodes. That 24 feet starts to make a difference in its relationship to the scale of that road. So the ways that you can achieve that, it doesn't mean that your ceiling inside has to be so high, but through parapets and things like that, you can achieve that 24 feet. If one of these slides I have coming up shows what we're talking about in a little bit more detail, but it's allowing for the building to have some character without being too squatty given the scale of that road.
Well, that would also include a Walgreens, CVS.
That's right.
Fast food. You don't want any of those along the bypass.
Oh, you can have them. It's just
That
a
won't be
dimensional
20.
requirement for height.
Will they be 24 feet high?
That's in some places it could get lower. Actually, Joe, if you want to skip ahead to a couple slides.
I think
So
normally that high anyway, aren't
this
they?
is these are two examples where we are defining what the minimum height might be, and we're trying to make sure that you get enough height there so that what's really the lowest point still has enough substance to it that it really has an appropriate scale. But we don't want to have porches, porticocheres, things like that subject to it, because if you had that, then the Starbucks would have kind of a funny look without those kinds of appurtenances to it that really give it some character. So we want to be able to have those kinds of features on buildings that help articulate the architecture and make it a little more interesting and not have those subject to the minimum height requirement. The building on the right is a Panera Bread, and the roof line, do you see the, Joe, if you want to point out with my cursor that right there, that's really the roof line. And so that whole area above it with the sign, that's just a parapet. And it's hiding a lot of equipment, but you can see it was on a road similarly scaled, or is on a road that's similarly scaled. And so it gives it a much better presence
enhances the
relationship to the
aesthetics of the
streetscape.
area.
It really does.
Yeah.
So the parapet's above the minimum.
It is. Oh, so that one gets up above 24 feet.
And Tom, it also gives you that consistency in that corridor.
Right.
One question I had in the draft, I think it says 20 feet for COD-N.
The Planning Commission actually recommended reducing it from 24 to 20.
So I was just
Oh,
trying to.
that's right.
That's what's in
That's
the
what
the
that is.
draft, yeah.
Sorry. That was,
So it should be 24?
it should be 20.
Oh, 20, okay. I
Right.
just wanted to make
Yeah,
sure.
that's right. The slide is
Okay.
not.
All
Thank
right.
you. I
That's
appreciate
fine.
that.
It's
That's
all
a
right.
detail I forgot.
We had a little argument before we started because one section of our paperwork said 20 feet, one section said 24 feet.
Let's see if you guys are paying attention.
Let me ask another question on the height. When you get to this 500 feet, and you get toward the end of it, and the 500 feet includes going up another road, how does that, I don't understand why, even if I accepted the 24 feet along the corridor, why going up a side road in effect? Why should they have the same requirements as something along the southern bypass?
Right. So it's the visibility. And so when you are looking at those perpendicular streets, they maintain that same character that the development edge along the corridor has. And so it's just a consistency along that edge.
Well, somewhere along the way, you go back into one story, right?
You can eventually.
Well, these are one
That's
story,
right.
just goes down in height.
I understand that.
Right.
It's all based on aesthetics. I mean, we can have another Highway 160, or we can have Valentine Commons Boulevard. And, we want it, you only get to do this
Pick a
once.
better example.
You only get to do this
Please.
once. Well, maybe we'll have something that somebody else could use as an example.
I agree.
And, you only get to do it once, and it's going to be there for a lifetime. So we need to do it right.
One of the other things that this allows you to accomplish is if you are doing a non-residential building and you're wanting to, or multifamily, and you're wanting to exceed the maximum height, let's say you're in COD-N, you want to exceed the maximum height, after your setback line, at that height, you can start stepping it back 1 to 1. And so you can achieve a higher building as you get further away from your property line and be able to get more maximize your development area a little bit more, but only after you've stepped further back from the setback line. The other thing we wanted to note was that in the heights of buildings, we don't want to count, I mean, you already have a substantial list in your ordinance, and we're carrying that over into this, but the kinds of things that would not count towards that height limit, because you want to be able to have those kinds of architectural treatments that really give some interest and some change in the roof lines and things like that. One of the things that we did note in the requirements that in some of the underlying zoning districts, your maximum height might not be as high as 45. Where you're in COD-N, you can go up to 45. If your underlying zoning doesn't allow that, you can in this overlay district. So that's some additional use of your property that you might not have otherwise if you were just in the underlying zoning.
And I'm probably jumping the gun here, Meg, but will this include signage?
We've got a whole section on
Section on
signage, yes. So a lot of it is what you can do today, but there are a few details that you can't. So we've already talked about that. Orientation, we're really trying to, I mean, the main gist of this is trying to keep the bypass from having a whole bunch of rears of buildings facing the bypass. So the treatment of the rears of buildings, particularly the multifamily and the non-residential, we're trying to get development to face the bypass and really address the bypass. And in the case of your primary entrances, it's fine to have the primary entrances on the bypass, and the folks who are the tenants are probably going to also want an entrance off the parking lots that would be to the rear. In those instances, we want to be able to get the facades of those buildings to have the same kind of level of detail that your fronts would ordinarily have. So even if it is the rear, it would still has that quality that a front facade would have. The other option is to screen it according to the screening requirements, so that if it's not, if it doesn't have that front door kind of look to it, that the landscaping minimizes that impact. And this really sort of gets at that whole thing I was just talking about with the primary entrances. So, and you still can have two entrances, or you can have just a look that sort of feels like it's got a front entrance, even if there isn't a door. The loading areas, obviously, we would want to screen those from visibility. And then materials. The commercial appearance review addresses this a great deal, so some of this is capturing what's a lot of times decided during those types of reviews and trying to limit the materials that are used to maintain a certain quality that you already have in Fort Mill. And so you're seeing rock, stone, brick, stucco, concrete, wood, or hardy plank, any one of those, the kinds of things that people are using or are getting approved by the commercial appearance review, and we wanted to go ahead and put that into this code. The mirrored glass, not expected at all in COD-N, but some of that may be in the balance of COD with a limitation on how much reflectance that has. Corrugated metal is not something the town typically approves, so we went ahead and added that to the list of materials that would not be permitted on any facade. We really would like to see some articulation, because that monotony of driving down a bypass and seeing something that is roughly the same scale, same treatment, same materials, and so on, you want to encourage that variation, not just in the facade treatments with, you know, the idea of the fenestration, the windows, the awnings, those kinds of things, but also in the roof lines. So the buildings adjacent to each other, being able to see a little difference in those roof lines also adds to the interest. So that's encouraged with these standards. Street trees. The streetscape certainly would be enhanced a great deal with the landscaping, and so we've addressed both the street trees and then landscaping in that front setback and COD-N. So canopy trees along the bypass at a pretty regular spacing would be planted in that setback in the first 15 feet. And then, go ahead, Joe. There are also some requirements for shrubs to complement that. So based on a square footage, there's a calculation that can be done when you subtract out some of the driveways and things like that, what exactly the planting requirement would be. So that whole combination gives you a better street frontage and hopefully also adds to the streetscape. And so again, this is just looking back at that dimension of what you can do in the 35 feet. So that's representing what that landscaping requirement might look like in front of a building. And that too. When you get into COD, the balance, you have a little bit more flexibility in what you can do because of the variation in setback. One of the things that we would like to try to encourage with, and that's what's reflected in these requirements, is that you do have some great stands of trees out there, some natural vegetation. So this is not to suggest that anything out there would be cleared unnecessarily, but that preservation of vegetation, especially the significant trees that you already have a requirement for in your ordinance, that would be maintained, but you're supplementing where the existing vegetation doesn't really achieve the streetscape requirements. And so in those areas where you don't have it, in the 50-foot setback, you're following the landscaping requirements for a 50-foot landscape buffer. And if you're choosing to go 100 feet back, then you don't have to plant so much, and you can follow the planting requirements for a 20-foot landscape buffer. We're trying to recognize the costs there. If you're giving up land to be 100 feet back, that's one thing you're giving up. If you're choosing to get closer and utilize more of your land, the cost comes in the landscaping, but either way it creates a positive relationship. And so that's the dense illustration of that landscaping in the 50 feet versus the next one would be the looser landscaping. This is just that bird's eye view of that. And the other thing I wanted to note about this too is you do have that flexibility to have a meandering sidewalk, especially if you're trying to avoid a significant tree that you've saved. There's nothing about this to suggest that you have to follow some rigid guideline about where that sidewalk location should be. And so, so balancing that with the need to have that vegetation preserved is recognized in here. The buffers, you saw notes to that, and for consistency, we're trying to keep some of those details the same so that you're accomplishing two or three things with the same landscaping. And so the landscape buffers are described in the same way, with the natural undisturbed areas protected, significant trees protected, and then where those gaps are, you're filling in according to the buffer requirements. And those buffers come into play when you're trying to screen or meet any of the other landscape requirements that show up as recommended in either other requirements. Those trees need to go in at a minimum of 2 inches in caliber, and that's measured 4 feet above the base and 8 feet in height, so that you've got some immediate impact with those trees.
It's 2 inches, not 2 feet.
Oh, 2 inches, yeah.
That's a pretty big tree.
Huge.
Well, what is a significant tree?
That's defined in your ordinance, and Joe helped me out. It's got a definition of a certain caliber,
I don't
and
remember off the top of my head. I can get that for you, though.
I tried to read, I tried for a while to read this thing, gave up.
Yeah, I want to say
But
it's,
I couldn't find what a significant tree was.
we do have something in our, I don't think it's in the zoning. I think it's in the code of ordinances. But I'll get that for you for a second. I want to say it's around 30 or 36 inches in caliper, but I can get the exact information.
yeah, for all of these, we're trying as much as possible to be consistent with some of the standards you already have for certain reasons in other places in your code, and so that's why we're carrying some of those over.
Define 2 inches in caliber. What's caliper mean?
It is, so,
Caliper.
it is that, yeah, it's the diameter,
Diameter.
right, not the
4 feet.
circumference.
Yeah.
With the buffers, you have, it's scalable based on the size of the parcel. You don't want to unnecessarily burden somebody with a huge buffer when they have a small parcel to begin with and almost leave their parcel not as developable as it needs to be. So under 5 acres, where you have a requirement to have a buffer against existing development, it's 20 feet. As you go to 5 to 10 acres, it grows to 35 feet in width, and over 10 acres, it's 50 feet. And so these landscaping requirements that you're seeing here would go along with each of those, but it's the number of plants of each type within each 100 linear feet of that buffer that's delineated. And so in a 5-acre tract, if you've got a 20-foot buffer, you're non-residential against an existing subdivision, and you find that 20 feet measured from the property line on your side, the developing side, and within that 20-foot strip, for every 100 feet, you'd be doing the 3 canopy trees, 6 understory, and then 9 shrubs in combination.
Is it just in the front between you and the street?
Well, so there are 2 things about that, is the buffers are really used for the separation between non-residential multifamily against existing single-family residential. But because of what it's accomplishing, the streetscape requirements that you saw also reference that buffer, because that combination of landscaping is achieving a similar thing in terms of being able to screen loading areas, screen rears of buildings from a bypass. So we thought, why not stick with something that's consistent, that's accomplishing a similar effect. The one thing I wanted to point out to you too, and I'll go back to the yellow columns on this, but you've got some standards now in your ordinance with respect to multifamily or non-residential against single family, and it does call for evergreen trees and shrubs, I think, but it might just be trees. And it's not as much landscaping as we're calling for here. So we're beefing that up with these standards where you're in this overlay district, and we're also, where that comes into play, the requirement is to have evergreen in those places. So it's in the streetscape areas, you have that ability to have a mixture with the deciduous, but that particular relationship requires evergreen plants. The yellow columns, you get a reduction in the width and the amount of landscaping if you're using fences and walls. And there are some requirements I'll get to about fences and walls, but if you choose to make that part of that edge condition, then you can reduce the width and the amount of landscaping.